So welcome everybody. My name is Jerry Pritchard and I'm one of the members of staff of the University of Birmingham School of Biosciences, where I'm a lecturer, and my research focuses on the Birmingham Institute of Forestry Research, looking at climate change. There's loads to see on our stand related to all our courses, so please come and see us afterwards. So today I'm going to ask some very specific questions about forests and their impact on climate change, which illustrates some of the work that we do. As you know, and you can feel it today, we know about global warming and we know about elevated CO2 as a greenhouse gas, which is specifically what I'm going to talk about, leading to elevated temperatures and a big impact on the climate and the weather and so on. My garden is getting very dry and I could do with some more rain. These heat waves are really having an impact on health, agriculture, infrastructure and so on. So CO2 is the key part of this. As you know, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas being produced by fossil fuel burning over the last couple of 100 years. And that blanket effect gives the warming and the impact on the weather that we're all used to. This is the carbon cycle that you may be familiar with. And the key point that I'm going to focus on, where my research is on this part, the role of plants, in particular trees and photosynthesis, in taking in some of that CO2 and asking the question, well, if the CO2 levels are higher, how does that impact the carbon cycle? Do we capture more carbon, or do we stimulate the economy, the carbon economy of the soil and so on? So the fundamental question is, will planting trees get us to net zero? And I think what the key answer to this will be, it depends, and it depends on what are the limiting factors to photosynthesis, and I'll talk you through some of that now. Clearly, carbon dioxide, if we think about it simplistically, as it is the main food for plants, generates the carbohydrates that are all important to all the food webs. You can see here's a tree being grown with elevated carbon dioxide, and you can see the tree gets bigger. If you give it more food, it gets bigger. So you might say, well, that's no problem then. We just have to wait for these forests, these trees, the Amazon rainforest to grow a bit more and to capture more of that carbon, and we'll get back to stability. But as I say, because of limiting factors, it's not as simple as that. So if you have a tomato salad for your lunch, you will be eating a plant that has been grown under elevated CO2. Commercial tomato growers squirt carbon dioxide into their greenhouse to stimulate the growth of the tomatoes. But of course, unlike a natural situation, they control the other limiting factors. So they supply light, they have the correct temperature, they irrigate, they provide water, they provide nutrients, mineral nutrients, and they control the pests and diseases. So we've removed all the limiting factors, and so the carbon dioxide can be exploited by the plant and grow bigger tomatoes. So I want to take you now from the NEC, which is where we currently sit. There we are now, and there's Birmingham. Those of you who know Birmingham. If we go north of Birmingham, just to the west of Stafford, and you will zoom in there. This is a Google Earth, so you can go and follow this yourself later on. If we go in to this place, Norbury Junction, if you look carefully into the forest, you will see some strange features. You'll see some rings, and you'll see these big tanks, and this is part of our experiment where we are fertilizing this forest. There you can see it a little bit more clearly. These are the CO2 tanks. We have 6 rings, about 25 meters high and 25 meters across, and they contain about 6 or 7 mature oak trees in this 180-year-old forest. And what we're doing is the same experiment, the same thing that the tomato grower does, but we're doing it in a natural environment where we're supplying extra carbon dioxide to 3 of these rings, but we're not altering anything else. So we're getting an understanding of what the natural world, specifically these oak forests, will look like in 50 years' time, because we're supplying the CO2 levels that the models predict these forests will be exposed to in 50 years' time. So 3 of them get ambient CO2 and 3 of them get elevated CO2. Here's another view of those rings, the 6 rings, from a drone, this time taken in the winter before the leaves are off. And here's a close-up of one of the actual rings. These are full-sized oak trees, and the CO2 is released in a computer-controlled system from these black pipes hanging down, and simply the wind just blows it into the forest, where detectors then feed back what the concentrations are and open or close the valves depending on the levels that are there. And so if the wind was blowing from the left, these valves will be open and these valves will be closed. And basically we go into these. Here you can see a close-up, see the size of, there's a person for scale. Here's the pipe carrying the air or the CO2 around the rings. Here's some of the oak trees, and here's the base of the pylons. And there it is looking up to the canopy where all the action is. So here, actually, you have to go up to the top of the canopy to do the measurements.
So fantastic to be up here. This is a unique experience to be right at the top of the canopy. Hardly ever visited, hardly ever researched, but this is where the action is. This is where the impact of climate change will really happen for these trees. So fantastic to be up here. This is a unique...
So we have to go up to the top of these trees to do the measurements. And so if we're giving the trees more carbon dioxide, the fundamental question is, like those trees you saw earlier, like the tomatoes, will they take in more carbon dioxide? And I'll talk you through this graph because this is the key one, the first key bit of data that comes out. And it basically says that under elevated carbon dioxide, with the levels of carbon dioxide we expect in 50 years time, the trees will do more photosynthesis. So here on this axis, this is the level of photosynthesis. So the higher that is, the more carbon the trees are fixing. This is 7 in the morning and this is 7 at night, and June, July, August, September. And the red line is the 3 rings that have extra CO2, and the blue line is the ones that are getting the ambient levels of CO2. So the red line is telling us something about 50 years in the future. And what you can see in the summer when the leaves are on and the trees are doing photosynthesis, you can see that the trees are actually capturing about 30% more carbon. So these trees under elevated CO2 are collecting more carbon dioxide. So you might say, that's great, but they are going to help us achieve carbon zero. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So the CO2 is going into the trees and the carbon is being captured. So the next question is to understand what choices the tree will make about how to distribute that carbon where it uses those extra resources. And it's got lots of different choices. And it will, of course, depend on limiting factors. And I'm going to talk about one specific limiting factor that may be an issue, and that is the choice it makes depending how much nutrient it's got. So the first thing that we see using this band, which is called a dendrometer, all the trees have these little bands on it, and there is a citizen science project that your schools can take part in. We put these bands on and we measure over the years since we started putting in CO2 that the trees with extra CO2 who are doing extra photosynthesis are actually taking in or actually growing, putting bigger tree rings down, about 10% more. So there is more trunk growth under elevated CO2. So that is also contributing to the idea that we are getting that carbon being taken out of the air, synthesized into carbohydrates and stored in the trunk, which again is a positive thing. So this is under high nutrients though, because these soils have a relatively level of high nutrients. So there isn't a limiting factor of other nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus or potassium. But it's not always the case. Those nutrients may run out. And indeed, if we go over to Australia, there's another experiment there doing the same as what we're doing with the oak forest, but they're doing it with eucalyptus. And what they see there is that they don't get an increase in productivity because there's a shortage of phosphorus in the soil. So if you were to fertilize those trees with more phosphorus, you would get a stimulation of growth. You would have removed that limiting factor. But we don't have to do that in the UK oak system because they already have enough nutrients in the soil. That limiting factor isn't currently an issue. So the question remains, in the oak forest, we could run out of phosphorus. And so the question remains, well, so under elevated CO2, if you've got low nutrients, you don't get that extra growth. But if the trees have more carbon, how could they spend that on getting more nutrients? And there's a number of different ways they could do that. The roots could grow bigger to search out more nutrients. You could fix nitrogen. You could get a bacterial symbiosis to help you fix nitrogen. You could put more carbon into the ecosystem in order to stimulate that ecosystem and generate more nutrients in the soil. Or you could feed more of those nutrients to your mycorrhizae, to fungal helpers that get you nutrients. And all of those things can work, but we notice in our forest that the trees, here's somebody putting a camera into the soil to measure the root growth, and you can see the orange bars are the elevated CO2, and you can see that the roots are growing longer under elevated CO2, so the trees got more carbon and they're spending some of it on the roots growing more, which is helping them to maintain the nutrient supply, so they're overcoming that limiting factor. There's also more leaves produced under elevated CO2. Here you can see, since the carbon was switched on, the orange bars, the elevated CO2, there is more leaf litter, more carbon going into the soil. And indeed, that carbon rain into the soil is stimulating soil respiration. So it is stimulating the soil ecosystem. These are the little robots that we have that periodically measure the soil respiration, which is how we know that with that extra leaf fall, extra root growth, that extra carbon going into the soil is stimulated, the bacteria and the fungi live and die and produce more nutrients that the roots can then take up and again overcome those limiting factors. However, that is the tree overcoming the limiting factors, but of course there's a negative side to that if we're interested in carbon zero, because those trees that respiration is producing carbon dioxide, which is then coming back out of the soil. So there you can see the carbon cycle is being stimulated in terms of decomposition and release of that carbon dioxide. So while the trees are taking in carbon dioxide and growing more, both trunks and roots and leaves, they're also stimulating the soil ecosystem and producing more carbon dioxide. And we're 8 years into the experiment. We don't know where that will stabilize. And of course, it does heavily depend on limiting factors. So will planting trees help us get to net zero? And the answer is no, not if there are poor soil nutrients, or indeed other other limiting factors. And one that I haven't talked about is, of course, water. If there is drought, then the trees might save water instead of opening their stomata to do more photosynthesis. However, if we plant the trees in the right place, with the right conditions, then these trees will store carbon, and they will, on a net basis, help us pull down carbon from the atmosphere to deliver net zero. So I'd just like to finish off with a couple of extra resources that are available. This link will take you to the BIFoR education resources, where you can see a huge range of activities related to some of what I've told you, but also other aspects of your biology and geography curriculum that you might find useful, including this virtual tour. There's also a virtual tour of a mangrove forest. There's also a virtual tour of a Amazon rainforest, and we're updating that all the time when the new results come out. So follow that link. And thank you for listening. I hope it's given you something useful that fits into your curriculum and stimulates your interest in this area of biology more generally, and think about a career in sustainability and climate change. And as I say, please come and see us in our stand over the next couple of days, where we've got some virtual tours and literature and activities and competitions about a range of activities in the biosciences. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.